Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, October 16, 2024. Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, campaigns near Philadelphia, getting support from over 100 Republicans, including former members of Congress and Trump administration officials. Donald Trump, former president and Republican presidential nominee, takes part in a town hall with women in Georgia. It was hosted by Fox News Channel. A judge in Georgia blocks a ballot hand count rule, warning it could cause administrative chaos. We'll talk about the implications with USA Today Justice Department reporter Aysha Bagchi. The Small Business Administration disaster loan account runs out, putting on hold loans to those affected by Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Will get White House reaction. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations disputes U.S. claims that Israel has been preventing humanitarian aid from entering Gaza, saying Hamas has been the holdup. The U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan talks about the civil war in that country going on for over a year and why the humanitarian suffering has not been as widely known as the wars in the Mideast or Ukraine. And in Washington, a memorial service for Ethel Kennedy. Tributes from 3 U.S. presidents, a former House Speaker, and a lot of Kennedy family members, plus performances from music stars Stevie Wonder, Kenny Chesney, and Sting. CBS News article previewing the vice president's trip today writes that she is traveling to Bucks County for a campaign event Wednesday, just 2 days after she visited western Pennsylvania for a rally in Erie. Vice President Harris is set to speak at Washington Crossing Historic Park this afternoon, where her campaign says she'll be joined by more than 100 Republicans, including former Republican lawmakers and ex-Trump aides who are supporting her candidacy. Former Illinois Congressman and January 6th committee member Adam Kinzinger, who endorsed Harris for president back in August, also scheduled to speak. Harris' campaign shall discuss patriotism, unity, and bipartisanship in her remarks. That was the preview from CBS News. Here's part of Vice President Harris's speech late afternoon.
So I am joined today by over 100 Republican leaders from across Pennsylvania and across our country who are supporting my candidacy for President of the United States. And I am deeply honored to have their support. Some served in state houses, some in the United States Congress, some worked for other Republican presidents and presidential nominees, including Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan. And some today served in Donald Trump's own administration. We also have with us Republican voters from here in Pennsylvania and beyond, who have been active in their Republican parties for years, who have supported Republican candidates up and down the ticket. Now, I say all that to make an obvious point. In a typical election year, you all being here with me might be a bit surprising, dare I say unusual. But not in this election. Not in this election. Because at stake in this race are the democratic ideals that our founders and generations of Americans before us have fought for. At stake in this election is the Constitution of the United States, its very self. We are here today because we share a core belief that we must put country before party.
Vice President Kamala Harris, Democratic presidential nominee at Washington Crossing Historic Park, about 30 miles north of Philadelphia. Former President Donald Trump, the Republican presidential nominee, was at a town hall with women only on Fox News Channel. It was recorded Tuesday in Cumming, Georgia, and aired today on that cable network. Topics included the economy, child care, abortion, IVF, transgender women in sports, immigration, and crime. Here's one of the questions and answers.
I'm Nancy. I'm from Milton, Georgia, originally from Ohio. Good. But go Dogs. Yeah. And thank you for coming. Furthering the discussion on immigrant crime, along with liberal-run cities where crime is out of control, my son is a Georgia Bulldog. he was on campus the day Laken Riley was murdered. Terrifying for all those kids, right? I wanted to know, how quickly in a sanctuary city, like they're calling Athens, Georgia, how quickly can you remove those threats to our society so that our children can go out on a run, as they rightfully should be able to do, in a park in the daytime by themselves? It should not be like that. And also, I was wondering, I watch television all the time. I see your ads. I don't see a lot of vocalness about these sort of crimes, these hideous crimes in your promotion. Yeah. So I'm wondering why that is.
Well, we are into it. First of all, we are going to end all sanctuary cities immediately. We're going to end them because they're really...
Is that an executive order you do that with?
I can do it with an executive order. I'll have to do it with an executive order. You can do it with the Aliens Act of 1798. We can do things in terms of moving people out. We can move them out of the sanctuary cities. You have some liberal, crazy people that they fight. Normally you like to understand the opponent. Like in business, you want to understand what is the opposites, why do they want this? You want to try and figure why do they want open borders? Why do they want to do this? Why do they want sanctuary cities? Sanctuary cities are really meant for one thing, to protect criminals. That's what they become. We're going to end all sanctuary cities in the United States, and we're going to go back to normalcy. And we're going to have law and order. We're going to we have to reinvigorate our police. We have great police. They're not allowed to do their job. If they do their job with gusto, which is what we want them to be fair. And the sad thing is you'll always have a bad apple and, hundreds and hundreds of arrests, one bad arrest, and it's on the front page of every newspaper. And these people are incredible. They want to do their job, just like the Border Patrol. They want to do their job. We're going to let them do their job, and I'm going to give them immunity. We're going to protect them because they do things and they end up getting sued. They lose their family. They lose their house, they lose their pension, they lose everything. The police officers in this country are law enforcement and sheriffs, everything else. They have to be given back their dignity. They want to do their job. But we become so politically correct. I mean, you look at New York and Chicago and LA and every city, all run by Democrats, okay? Liberal, stupid Democrats. No, and our country...
So, Mr.
Our
President,
country has lost its way. So it's a good question. In other words, we're going to have law and order.
Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee, a town hall with women on Fox News Channel, taped Tuesday in Georgia, aired today on Harris Faulkner's show. She was the moderator. Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporting today that former President Jimmy Carter told his family he was more interested in voting for Vice President Kamala Harris than his milestone birthday earlier this month. On Wednesday, he got his wish by filling out a ballot for his fellow Democrat that was put in the drop box at the Sumter County Courthouse near his hometown of Plains. The Carter Center confirmed the former president voted by mail today. Jimmy Carter turned 100 years old on October 1st. An article from USA Today, a Georgia judge blocked a controversial ballot hand count rule from going into effect before the November election. Aysha Bagchi, USA Today Justice Department correspondent, has been reporting on this and joins us now by phone. Thanks for being with us. What did the rule require? Why did the judge say it can't take effect?
Yes, the rule would have required every voting precinct in Georgia, according to the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. For the state, there are 2,400 of those. It would have required every single one to have 3 poll officers that hand count the ballots. What that means is unsealing ballot boxes and counting those ballots by hand. Each of those poll officers would have needed to come to identical tallies for how many ballots there were. And then there would be a poll manager who would check to see if that tally matched the figures produced by machines. And if the tally didn't match figures produced by machines, that poll manager has to work to correct the inaccuracy. So basically, it was a rule that would have required ballots to be counted. It means needing to basically suddenly train a lot of poll workers to do something that they hadn't been prepared to do before in the final weeks before the election. And the judge struck it down by concluding that the words he used were irreparable harm. that putting this rule into effect before the election, so close to the election, was just going to lead to administrative chaos. Some of the words he used were that the hand count rule was too much, too late, and for that reason, it shouldn't go into effect before the election. He noted that there were Republican election officials in the state who advised against the rule. That included the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who has warned that the rule could increase the risk of fraud or mishandling ballots and also create delays in getting election results. And that included the State Attorney General, Chris Carr, who advised that he thought the rule was probably unlawful. So for those reasons, the judge said maybe the rule would be smart policy at a different time when there was more time for people to prepare, but it's not a good idea for this election.
This rule was put into place by the state election board. You point out that 3 Republican members voted for it. Is the board partisan? How does that work?
Well, the board is composed of 5 people. Technically, one of them is appointed by Republicans, but the 2 others are also Republicans. One of them is appointed by each of the 2 houses in the state legislature. And then you do have a board member who is appointed by Democrats. And then you have the board chair, and his name is John Flavier. He was appointed by the state governor, who's a Republican, but he has been very clear to point out that his role is nonpartisan. So there are 3 who identify as Republicans, and what they would say is that their role is just to think about what kind of rules are wise for Georgia elections. So not necessarily that they're seeing things through a partisan lens, but it is clear that there is some sort of association between them and a wider Republican apparatus. We know that at least one contemplated rule in recent months was a rule that had been discussed in the email with a Republican head in the state. And Donald Trump, in an early August rally, actually called out those 3 members of the 5-person board by name and praised them, calling them pit bulls fighting for honesty, transparency, and victory. That doesn't mean that those 3 members are always going to do what Republican officials or Donald Trump wants them to do, but they certainly do have some partisan affiliations.
This rule was put into place because of, the board members would say, because there was distrust in an accurate vote count. And now that the judge is blocking the rule, it seems like there might be distrust based upon that. It seems like a no-win situation.
Yes. I mean, the judge kind of acknowledged that. He invoked the memory of January 6th, the 2021 attack on the Capitol, and he said that for some, that's a day of fame, and others a day of infamy. But he kind of highlighted that there's a charged atmosphere around the upcoming election because of memories of what happened 4 years ago. And it's very true that there are going to be people who were really alarmed about the new rule and the ways in which it might have caused chaos and delays in the aftermath of election or jeopardized the security of ballots. And then there are going to be other people who were happy with the board's actions and wanted to see poll workers at local precincts be hand counting these ballots. So there's no question that there's going to be a lot of tension around the upcoming elections. Polls show that there is quite a lot of division among Americans about the security of our elections. And while I've talked to a lot of election law experts who feel pretty confident that the upcoming election is going to be secure in spite of that kind of inflamed atmosphere, they're less confident about how Americans will view things and whether we can come back to a wider public confidence in the security of our elections.
We're talking with Aysha Bagchi from USA Today. We've been hearing for months that lawyers on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are gearing up to file challenges after the election. What have you seen?
Yes, well, I've seen a lot of things happening before that could signal what's coming afterwards. For example, there have been a lot of lawsuits, including by Republican organizations, that basically challenge the way in which states maintain voter registration lists. Basically, this is thinking about how you purge names from these voter registration lists. And that is something that is supposed to happen, but there is a federal law in place that regulates how you do that. It's called the National Voter Registration Act. And it's basically in place to make sure that people who are eligible to vote can show up and vote, but also that over time, these lists kind of remain clean. The lawsuits, I've been told by election law experts, could signal the types of arguments that we may see after the election takes place. Some of the lawsuits make arguments that there are too many people on registration lists, and they compare census data to these lists. Then you have experts who kind of focus on these lists say that, well, the census data isn't a really good comparison because it's measuring something else. It's measuring where you sleep, and that's not really the right way to think about who is registered to vote in a jurisdiction. And also the lawsuits talk about unauthorized immigrants and say things that speak to a major policy debate happening in the country as well. But they may signal what we're going to see after the election in terms of lawsuits being filed where people are expressing a lack of confidence in those registration lists or challenging who was able to vote. It is important to emphasize that studies indicate the number of people who were not citizens who vote is very, it's minuscule, it's rare, it hasn't happened at the kind of rate that could have affected a national election outcome. But that's definitely an area we could see. We're also seeing Justice Department lawsuits in at least a couple places that are challenging the ways in which people have been kicked off those voter registration lists. So those lawsuits are often supported by Democrats in this upcoming election. And then we might see some lawsuits that have to do with how states and counties certify results once the election takes place. We have seen some local county officials in the past 4 years refuse to certify election results. That hasn't actually resulted in an election result being overturned so far, but there has been that kind of activity. And actually, just this week, a judge in Georgia made a ruling that county election officials have to certify results by the state deadline. That's November 12th in Georgia, that it's not an option. It's not something that you have discretion over. You have to certify. But that's definitely a tension point where people are worried that you might not get certification results in time, and that might be something that people bring to courts to try to get judges to force election officials to certify results.
Aysha Bagchi, USA Today Justice Department correspondent. You can find her stories at usatoday.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.
Associated Press article from Dallas, Texas. Republican Senator Ted Cruz and Democratic Congressman Colin Allred met for their only debate Tuesday night, trading attacks over abortion and immigration in a closely watched race that could help determine which party wins control of the U.S. Senate. Nationally, Democrats view Texas as one of their few potential pickup chances in the Senate this year, while Cruz has urged Republicans to take Texas seriously amid signs that the former 2016 presidential contender is in another competitive race to keep his seat. That was from AP. These were the candidates' closing statements at the end of the hour-long debate, beginning with Colin Allred.
Listen, we're all Texans. My idol, John Lewis, used to say that we might have come here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. We're all Americans, and we're all Texans. We need a leader who will bring us together around our shared values. That's what I've tried to do in my 6 years in Congress. That's the exact opposite of what Senator Cruz has done. Whatever he says tonight, you've seen it for 12 years. He's been one of the most divisive senators in the entire country. If you don't like how things are going in Washington right now, well, you know what? He is singularly responsible for it. He has introduced this new kind of angertainment where you just get people upset and then you podcast about it and you write a book about it and you make some money on it. But you're not actually there when people need you, like when the lights went out. When 30 million Texans were relying on a senator to spring into action, he went to Cancun. That's who he is. If you give me the chance to be your United States Senator, I'll never abandon you. And I'm asking for your vote and for your support in this election.
Congressman, thank you. Senator Cruz, you get the final word tonight. You have 60 seconds.
The stakes in this election are the highest of my lifetime. Congressman Allred and Kamala Harris are both running on the same radical agenda. Congressman Allred has pledged to be the 50th vote for Chuck Schumer to end the filibuster, to end the requirement of 60 votes to pass major legislation. That means if Congressman Allred is elected, we will see the Democrats, number one, strike down every voter integrity law in the country. Number two, add D.C. and Puerto Rico as states to give them 4 new Democrat senators. Number three, grant immediate voting rights to every illegal alien in America. That would turn Texas blue, and every statewide elected official in Texas would be defeated in the next election. And number four, pack the U.S. Supreme Court. That would jeopardize our fundamental rights. I've spent 12 years fighting every single day to defend jobs and freedom and security. Congressman Allred wants to destroy what we've got in Texas because he shares Nancy Pelosi and Kamala Harris's value.
Senator,
I will fight to keep Texas.
Senator, that is your time tonight.
A Texas U.S. Senate debate Tuesday night between incumbent Ted Cruz, Republican, seeking a third 6-year term, and the Democratic challenger, Congressman Colin Allred, who has been in the House since 2019. It was held at WFAA studios in Dallas. A Dallas-Fort Worth Telegram article about the debate reads, the candidates are in a tight race for the U.S. Senate with polls showing single-digit margins. The contest is getting national attention and drawing tens of millions of dollars as Democrats in Washington grapple to retain their razor-thin majority in the upper chamber. And a University of Houston poll released just before that debate shows Ted Cruz ahead of Colin Allred by 4 points, 50 to 46%. New York Times article, the Small Business Administration has run out of funds to provide low-interest loans to homeowners and businesses to repair property damaged by disasters, the Biden administration said on Tuesday. The drawdown of funds comes as residents across the Southeast are still recovering from the destructive impacts of Hurricanes Milton and Helene. Federal officials urged eligible people to continue to apply for loans, which they would continue to process while they wait for lawmakers to pass, quote, much-needed funding. But Congress is not set to reconvene until November 12th, and congressional leaders have not committed to calling members back sooner to approve more funding for the SBA or for FEMA. That was from the New York Times. The White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said at her news conference today at the White House that this issue needs to be addressed by Congress now.
As the president has said, we are in this for the long haul, and we will be there as long as it takes. That said, we need Congress to do its job. Yesterday, you heard from the president that the Small Business Administration's disaster loan program, which is a critical lifeline to small businesses, homeowners, renters affected by disasters, has been exhausted. Americans should continue to apply for these loans, and SBA will continue to process them and disperse assistance as soon as Congress does its job and provides the needed funding.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre at her news conference at the White House today. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican of Louisiana, issued a statement. There's no question these devastating back-to-back storms have stressed the SBA funding program. Congress is tracking this situation closely, and when members return in just a few short weeks, the administration should have an accurate assessment of the actual dollar amount needed, and there will be strong bipartisan support to provide the necessary funding. And an AP article reads, so far the SBA has received around 37,000 applications for relief from those impacted by Hurricane Helene and made more than 700 loan offers totaling about $48 million. It received 12,000 applications from those impacted by Hurricane Milton. Businesses can access loans up to $2 million, and the SBA also offers disaster loans of $500,000 up to that amount to homeowners to repair or replace disaster-damaged or destroyed real estate. That from AP. Wall Street today, the Dow up 337 points, NASDAQ up 51, S&P up 27. Federal Trade Commission is announcing a finalized rule to make it easier for people to cancel subscriptions and memberships they just don't want anymore, begins an NBC News article. It's called Click to Cancel. The FTC Commissioner Lena Khan said in an interview Tuesday that the rule is designed so that if consumers signed up online, they must also be able to cancel on the same website in the same number of steps. Social Security Administration's Chief Actuary Stephen Gross spoke today at the American Academy of Actuaries annual meeting in Washington about the financial condition of Social Security and proposed fixes. The Social Security Trustees report earlier this year said the program's trust funds will be depleted in 2035, and revenue will only be able to cover 83% of benefits, triggering an across-the-board benefit cut. Stephen Gross says there are many options available to Congress to make revenue equal costs.
The big question is, are we going to have a 25% reduction in the scheduled level of benefit, not promised, but the scheduled level? Or are we going to increase revenue by about a third, or some combination of the two? Historically, it's usually been a combination of the two. Now, some ways of lowering cost that have really been looked at and thought about a lot. One is an approach that would actually lower benefits, lifetime benefits for retirees, but not for the disabled. And if that is an appealing idea, then a way of doing that is to increase the full or normal retirement age. Back in '83 amendments, remember, it had been 65 was the normal retirement age for full benefit if you started then, and it went up to 67 by 2022. It could be raised further. One concern that's been raised along the way, especially back in the Simpson-Bowles Commission we dealt with back in 2010 was, mortality isn't the same for everybody. By race, ethnicity, and especially by income level, it really varies. So one way that was considered back then, and you can see it in our material up on the web, is to possibly have the retirement age increased, but maybe not increased or not increased as much for people with long careers and low income who typically have lower life expectancies. So that's another possibility. We could also have lower benefits mainly for the highest earners. We could change our PIA formula. Remember that benefit replacement rate? We could make it even sort of more tilted and lower the benefits even lower for the highest earners who have the opportunity to have more savings than lower income folks. And finally, there's the cost of living adjustment. Everybody heard about the 2.5%? It's coming up in January. Well, we could change the method for doing the cost of living adjustment away from the method for urban wage earners and clerical workers to a chain-weighted CPI. If we had another 15 minutes, it'd be fun to get into all the details on that. That would make it grow slower in the future, and that's a possibility. But there's also another possibility, which would be to have it grow faster by looking at how much prices grow for a particular group, people 62 and older. It sounds a little bit familiar, like our retirees, right? So if we look at the market basket of goods and services that people 62 and over buy, and you did our CPI on the basis of that, it would tend to be faster. In fact, for the COLA coming up in January, 2.5%, we looked at it to be actually 3% for coming up in January if the cost of living adjustment were done by the CPI-E for elderly. Some ways to increase revenue. Well, obviously, everybody's familiar with our 12.4% total payroll tax rate for employed folks, half by the employee, half by the employer, paid every year for quite a while now, up to the $168,600 limit for 2024. We just simply increase the payroll tax rate by 1%, 2%, 3%, any amount to really help to be at least a portion of fixing the shortfall we're facing in the future. Another possibility would be maybe not to raise the 12.4 at all, or not by as much, by way of increasing the share of all the covered earnings that are subject to tax. Remember, 90% was intended. We're down to about 82.5% now. We could get it back up to 90 is one possibility, or we could even get it higher than that. Some have suggested like the Medicare hospital insurance payroll tax rate, which probably everybody here knows well. It applies to all of your earned income. There is no limit for paying your 2.9% payroll tax for Medicare hospital insurance. So that would also be a possibility for Social Security that would bring a lot of extra revenue. One popular thing is to say, well, okay, only tax up to the $168,600 and then have a donut hole, have a span where there won't be any tax, but then above, say, $400,000 or some other select number tax above that. That's another sort of common one that we have seen. There's another possibility also of bringing in extra revenue, which is something that Social Security hasn't really done, is to say, well, Social Security already does get some revenue from interest paid on the trust fund reserve holdings, obviously, at straight up U.S. Treasury rates. Those investments could be invested elsewhere for a higher expected return. There have been places that have considered that back, the Bob Kerry Allen Simpson plan of 1995. We've got that up on the web also. Bob Ball back in the 94-6 Advisory Council, and many other plans have considered the idea of having our trust funds, now $2.8 trillion, not a small amount, could be invested in other than treasuries. If that were the case, we might get a higher return. That would be a plus.
Stephen Gross is Social Security Administration Chief Actuary, speaking today at the American Academy of Actuaries annual meeting in Washington. Stephen Gross joined the office of the Chief Actuary in 1973, right out of college, and then rose to become Chief Actuary in 2001. Social Security provides benefits to about 64 million Americans today, nearly 90% of those aged 65 or more receiving monthly benefits. Washington Today continues in a moment.
The weekly podcast is a unique offering from C-SPAN. We tape it right here in the C-SPAN studios in beautiful downtown Capitol Hill. In the town where extremes get all the attention, this isn't more extreme opinion, it's extreme history. From what's new and happening right now, relive the history you know. So listen, follow, and enjoy the C-SPAN podcast, The Weekly. Find it wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. That's free, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. Article from The Guardian newspaper: the U.S. has demanded proof on the ground that Israel does not have a policy of starvation in northern Gaza, as it turned up the pressure on the Netanyahu government to allow more aid into the territory. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, told the Security Council on Wednesday at a meeting convened by France, the UK, and Algeria that such a policy would not just be horrific and unacceptable, but also had implications under international and U.S. law. Her warning came after a U.S. government letter sent to Israel privately on Sunday, warning it would partly cut off arms supplies unless the supply of aid was permanently transformed within 30 days. That was from The Guardian. Here is the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, at today's Security Council meeting in New York City.
Some recent U.S. diplomacy has been discussed in the press. For the first time in weeks, the Erez crossing in northern Gaza has reopened, and Israeli authorities have committed to allow UN trucks to enter northern Gaza through at least one other route. Several dozen trucks of aid have entered northern Gaza for the first time in several weeks. But that's not enough. Many, many more deliveries are needed, and we will continue to push for that. In southern Gaza, we understand that UN convoys will be able to use a new route pending repairs, and that the IDF has committed to take steps to help secure delivery routes against armed gangs involved in violent looting, and will do so on a sustained basis. Israel is also working with the World Food Program on a plan to improve humanitarian infrastructure across the Gaza Strip, which, if implemented, could lead to the additional delivery of desperately needed food aid. A second round of polio vaccination is also underway in the south and will soon begin in the north. It is crucial that Jabalia camp is included in this effort. Colleagues, we know that commitments must be followed through on, and that the progress we've seen since last week is insufficient. And so for our part, the United States will continue to make the following clear. Food and supplies must be surged into Gaza immediately, and there must be humanitarian pauses across Gaza to allow for vaccinations and the delivery and distribution of humanitarian aid. A quote-unquote policy of starvation in northern Gaza would be horrific and unacceptable, and would have implications under international law and U.S. law. The government of Israel has said that this is not their policy, that food and other essential supplies will not be cut off, and we will be watching to see that Israel's actions on the ground match this statement.
Linda Thomas-Greenfield is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations at today's UN Security Council meeting in New York City. The Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, also took part in the meeting. Before that meeting began, he spoke to reporters outside the chamber.
Ambassador, it's Kamala from U.S. News and World Report. what is your take on the Biden administration's deadline of 30 days to increase aid to Gaza or risk U.S. aid?
So we have ongoing dialogue with our colleagues in Washington. There are a lot of issues manageable. For example, as we speak, Pamela, you have hundreds of trucks inside Gaza waiting. So they passed already the checkpoints, Kerem Shalom or Erez, but they are not capable of being delivered because of corruption, Hamas, poor management, corruption. So we are working with them to find ways to support and to improve the humanitarian efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador Michelle Nichols from Reuters. The US said in the letter that was sent that the amount of aid entering Gaza in September was the lowest for any month this year. The UN says there's barely any food left to distribute in northern Gaza, and that in the first 2 weeks of October, 85% of their attempts to move aid from south to north were denied by Israel. WFP says no food aid has entered northern Gaza for 12 days. So is this your response to the US letter that Hamas is to blame and there's nothing more Israel can do?
So first, as I said a minute ago, we are working with our partners to improve the situation, but you have objective obstacles on the ground. And the example I gave you right now, that as we speak, you have 500 trucks that pass these very checkpoints, but the aid is not being delivered. It's being wasted, it's being waiting there because you have problems of the truck drivers, of people who don't want to drive. So the blame is not on Israel, the blame is on Hamas, and we have to acknowledge that. You know, there is no shortage of aid. When you look at the amount of aid that is being delivered into Gaza, the problem is with the logistics to make sure it goes to the people who need it and not to the hands of the Hamas.
The Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Danny Danon, speaking to reporters at the UN in New York City before today's Security Council meeting. Washington Post article on Wednesday, the Lebanese Foreign Ministry said it filed a fresh complaint to the UN Security Council accusing Israel of violating Lebanon's territorial sovereignty and repeatedly targeting Lebanese army positions, aid groups, and civilians since October 3rd. Israel resumed airstrikes against the capital Beirut on Wednesday. That same day, the UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, said that a watchtower belonging to the group was attacked by an Israeli tank. That was from the Washington Post. More about aid to Gaza, the U.S. State Department held a news conference with spokesperson Matthew Miller, who said that Israel has taken steps to increase aid entering the territory, as the letter from Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin to Israeli officials said must happen, or future military aid from the U.S. might be in jeopardy.
On the letter, have you seen any improvement in aid flow to Gaza since it was sent on Sunday?
We have seen some improvement in the last few days. So a few things that we have seen the government of Israel do. Number one, we've seen them reopen the route from Jordan, whereby the Jordan military delivers humanitarian assistance directly to the north of Gaza. 50 trucks with food, water, and other humanitarian goods went in over that route yesterday. We have seen them reopen the Erez crossing in the north. We have seen them open a new access route from southern Gaza to northern Gaza to make sure aid that is coming in through Kerem Shalom can make it to the north. We've seen them open a new route for delivery inside southern Gaza. So again, aid that comes through Kerem Shalom that then gets delivered through southern Gaza. We have seen them take steps to approve new warehouses and other staging facilities for the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations to ease some of the logistical burdens that they have faced in storing and then delivering assistance inside Gaza. And it's our understanding that they informed the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations in the past 24 hours or so that they are going to waive the customs declarations that they were requiring individuals to sign to bring goods in. They're going to waive them for 12 months, which is an important step that the humanitarian organizations have called on to be taken and something that was included in the Secretary's letter. So we have seen them taking initial steps over the past several days, but of course the proof will be in the pudding ultimately, and we want to see them take additional steps, and we want to see ultimately the results change, and the results will be more trucks coming in, more food getting in, more water getting in, and civilians having the basic needs that they require to go about their daily lives.
State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller at his news conference at the State Department in Washington. CNN article reads, the United States is overwhelmingly the biggest supplier of arms to Israel. In 2023, 69% of Israel's arm imports came from the U.S., according to a report on international arms transfers by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Germany was the second largest, providing 30%, followed by Italy with 0.9%. The United Kingdom, France, and Spain were among other minor contributors. That was from CNN. The U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Thomas Perriello, spoke today about the civil war in Sudan, and he says the relatively small amount of world attention the conflict has garnered. A BBC News article earlier this month reads, a top Sudanese general has said the army will press on with its offensive despite international efforts to broker a ceasefire in the 17-month civil war. He was speaking just days after the army launched an operation to regain control of the capital Khartoum from the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. The two sides have been fighting since April last year, when their leaders fell out over the country's future. This has created a humanitarian catastrophe, with more than half the country facing hunger and millions forced from their homes. That was the BBC News article. Here is the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, Thomas Perriello, at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. today.
We are in a situation where the scale of human suffering is just impossible to wrap one's head around, whether that's at the scale of over 20 million people displaced and facing acute hunger. I mean, we're talking about just trying to imagine if every single resident of Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. was forced out of their home, every single person. It's difficult to think on that scale. And then you think on the personal scale, and you hear stories of people who've been forced into sexual slavery for months on end as the only way to either have food for their family. Like, when we think about hunger, we have to think about what hunger does to people. Physically, biologically, but also what it does to people in terms of the decisions they're making every day, the way that children's brains are developing. I mean, we're talking about just, you take one individual case and you can't wrap your head around it. And so it's all the more frustrating when we know that the world is paying so little attention to this relative to the scale of the crisis. And while we can talk about the fact that there's the elections, Gaza and the Ukraine, for the first 6 or 7 months of this conflict, it was pre-October 7th. It was not in the immediate election cycle, and we still were seeing almost no coverage of this. And while it is certainly true that we've seen that in the Western world, it's also been true that we've had a hard time getting the African press to cover this. We've had a hard time getting African civil society to engage on this for reasons we can perhaps delve into more. That being said, of course, there's one group of people that are incredibly focused on this with great courage, and that's the Sudanese people. And the Sudanese people continue to not only remind us that why we were all inspired back in 2019 about the aspiration to inclusive democracy, but we see groups like the emergency response rooms getting nominated for a Nobel Prize, finding ways to get food and medicine into the hardest to reach areas, doing so with pennies on the dollar in terms of aid. And we are seeing some of that scale up, and I think that our hope, the phrase I've been hearing more and more from the Sudanese people in the last few weeks, is let's make this the last war Sudan ever fights. So rather than a period where we've been looking at what's the lowest common denominator, let's just get to ceasefire, let's just get a pause, and we will continue to push for those things. But we're not even getting those things, and I think that's been driving people back to saying we can't be here a generation from now or a decade from now. We need to address some of the root causes that got us through this, and I'm seeing this kind of resurgence of some of that energy and that coalition building, envisioning by the Sudanese people of the future that they want and calling us into it rather than vice versa.
U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan Thomas Perriello at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. A Washington Post article today says Sudan's devastating civil war is being fueled in part by weapons secretly supplied to both sides by foreign countries, including munitions and drones from the United Arab Emirates and Iran, according to confidential assessments, a State Department-funded report and evidence collected from captured weapons in Sudan. That from the Washington Post. And this is Washington Today.
Isn't she lovely?
Stevie Wonder performing at the memorial service today for Ethel Kennedy, the widow of former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and an activist in her own right. She died last week at age 96. The service was held at the Cathedral of St. Matthew the Apostle in Washington, D.C., and began with Joseph Kennedy III, grandson of Ethel Kennedy and a former Democratic congressman from Massachusetts.
My grandmother's life was a life fully lived. She saw every moment as an opportunity to learn, to love, to compete, and to battle for what is right. Whether it was on the world stage or at the backgammon board, defending her record of 12,734 to 0. Her lessons were bountiful. Triscuits should be fried. Bacon goes with everything. If you want to get to 96, you should eat deviled eggs, fried chicken, and clam chowder for lunch every day. She taught us that size was no match for courage, especially when playing chicken with a Nantucket ferry while in a 26-foot sailboat with 18 passengers, 3 dogs, and guests who were scarred for life. That life is best enjoyed in the company of others. Elbows off the table, always. But fine if there are 3 dogs beneath it. And there is always room for one more. Cabinet secretaries and movie stars, priests and poets, and the kid next door. New friends who would become old friends. The occasional person who wasn't invited back. And the few who were actually never invited in the first place. Whoever you were, there was always a seat for you. She taught us that people were worth believing in. She saw the good that could be built when people come together. Whether it be a fort, or a family, or a country. That there's light to be found even in the darkness, and that laughter really was the best medicine. And courage. She used action and words to do her best to make the world a better place. She showed us how to stand strong in the face of adversity and to speak truth to power, and to respect the humanity in all of us. Life is to be lived. None of this is promised to us. What a privilege it is to see another day, to grow old, to get more time with the people that we love. So chin up, mind your manners, but don't you dare waste one precious second not enjoying the ride.
Joseph Kennedy III, the grandson of Ethel Kennedy and a former congressman, Democrat of Massachusetts, one of many Kennedy family members, speaking at today's memorial service in Washington, D.C. Also giving tributes, Martin Luther King III, House Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, 2 former presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Barack Obama calling Ethel Kennedy a big dose in a small package and a spitfire from a young age, saying as serious as Ethel was about righting wrongs, she never seemed to take herself too seriously. Bill Clinton calling Ethel Kennedy an amazing fireball with continuous energy. Also speaking, the current president, Joe Biden.
She invited me and my boys to her home after the accident. Left my family broken, having lost my wife and daughter and my boys barely making it. Along with Teddy, she got me through a time I didn't want to stick around. I wanted no part of being in the Congress and the Senate. I mean it. I spoke to my governor because we had elected a Democratic governor to find a replacement for me. But Teddy and Ethel Kennedy would hear none of it. You know, the fact is, like she did for the country, Ethel helped my family find a way forward with principle and purpose. We saw how she picked up Bobby's cause and stamped her own mark on the country. Marching for civil rights that you heard about today, and working to end poverty at home, attempting to secure peace abroad, and so much more. She once said, for anyone to achieve something, you have to show a little courage. You're only on this earth once. You must give it all you've got. Reminded me of my mom. My mom used to say, Joey, courage lives in every heart, and one day it will be called upon. Be ready to stand up, and that's from Catherine Eugenia Finnegan Biden, and she meant it. She meant it. For over 50 years, with her own iron will and moral courage, she gave it everything she had. And we're a better nation and a better world because of Ethel Kennedy.
President Joe Biden at today's memorial service in Washington, D.C. Ethel Kennedy died last week at the age of 96. Also during the service, performances by other music stars, including Kenny Chesney.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray.
And Sting.
When flesh and steel are one, drying in the color of the evening sun.
You can find the full video of today's memorial service from the cathedral in Washington at cspan.org. A story from CBS News writes, the matriarch of the storied Kennedy family is survived by 9 children, 34 grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.